I'd like to thank very much my right honourable friend from Malden for calling this debate. Just by way of background, I lived in Ukraine and the former Soviet Union from 1990 to 94. I have been conducting academic research into Russian warfare on and off since, and in the last couple of years I've made, I think, 4 or 5 trips to Kiev, both to the east of the country, to interview academic soldiers and other people involved in the current conflict. My right honourable friend for Walden is right to ask the question, why should we care about Ukraine? It is a place that's had only a modest impact on our imagination, and for much of the modern era it's been part of the Russian Empire, although Ukrainians do point to earlier periods in their history as proof of historic statehood, such as Kievan Rus and the Republican egalitarian Zaporozhian Cossack hosts, the Hetmanate. For me, I think we should care about Ukraine for the following reasons. The creation of an independent Ukrainian state was probably the single most important thing that happened or that accompanied the collapse of the USSR. It removed from the Russian state a population of approximately 50 million people, its main agricultural base, and one of its industrial and defence heartlands, and it completed the journey towards statehood begun by the Ukrainians in the 19th century. More broadly, in the East Slavic world, there are 3 states. There is Russia, there is Belarus, and there is Ukraine. Russia is now an authoritarian state whose population are fed a daily diet of a liberal and anti-Western propaganda. Belarus, sadly, is an external colony of Russia, and Russia's recent troop movements into that state are only likely to reinforce that. And then we have Ukraine. Out of the 3, only Ukraine makes any real pretense at being anything approaching a functioning democracy. Ukraine is the only country in the East Slavic world that seeks a role as a European state within a European, if you like, fraternity of nations. And Ukraine is the only country in the East Slavic states with a civic society which is neither being actively oppressed or co-opted by the state. And in my mind, much depends on the future of that civic society. There are undoubtedly problems. Post-Soviet corruption has been endemic there as anywhere, and I think we do underestimate the appalling impact of socialist totalitarianism on the structure of human societies. And my right honourable friend talking about Holodomor, the genocide of the Ukrainian peasantry, that was merely one example of it. However, it is worth pointing out that corruption has been fostered in part as a means of Russian subversion and control. The purpose and the intent of Russian activity in Ukraine, sadly, is to undermine Ukrainian statehood and indeed a Ukrainian identity that exists separate from Russia. And for many people in senior positions within the Kremlin, Ukrainian statehood and a Ukrainian identity separate from Russia is a cause of something approaching apoplexy and touches significant raw nerves within the Russian psyche. We see some of this Russian subversion in our own state, and I suspect we'll be discussing it tomorrow. But in Ukraine, as various speakers have pointed out, including the member for Huntington, who spoke with great eloquence on this, in Ukraine they are subjected to a much greater degree of that pressure. So the compromising of individuals and classes, the diet of media control and messaging. And this is not just upmarket PR, but a kind of violence against the mind designed to demoralize and disorientate. Now, in Soviet days, this disinformation, espionage, sabotage, and occasional assassination was known as active measures, and I think we are still reaching for a new name to call it. Some of us are calling it full-spectrum effects. It's a combining of these active measures, which used to be run by the KGB and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, with other forms of violence, including conventional military work. Under President Yanukovych, for example, NATO assistance programs were halted. The Ukrainian defense establishment hollowed out, which explains why the Ukrainians did so badly at the beginning of the war. Attempts were made to rewrite Ukrainian identity in new historical textbooks. Oil and gas was used as a means of control and of bribery. Russian businesses were used to exert indirect control over the Ukrainian state. And on top of that, in the past few years, since the Maidan Revolution, we have had direct violence via proxies, some of which were local, but many of which have been controlled and influenced by the FSB and the GRU, the Glavnaya Razvednoye Upravlenie, the main intelligence directorate of the Russians. Pro-Russian demonstrators, as well as violent thugs, the so-called Tatushki, were used or bussed in. Now, it is worth remembering that Russia's plans at the time were ambitious and were coordinating a series of uprisings in almost all the Russian-speaking counties, so Odessa, Nikolaev, Dnipro, Kharkiv, Zaporozhye. In many of these places, these uprisings failed and were put down by the Ukrainians. Not always particularly well, but they were. So one should remember that outside Donetsk and Lugansk, the Russian attempts to subvert and undermine Ukrainian statehood largely failed. Crimea was clearly an exception to that as well. There are some people who say, let's understand Russia, which I think too often is a code for appeasing them. I think one should always understand Russia. I think one should always talk to the Russians as much as possible and to engage with them. But I do think standing up to them is important, and not appeasing them is important for this reason, that if we appease them and effectively give them a sphere of influence within Eastern Europe, this is going to be years and decades of instability which will threaten us and cost us a great deal in time and effort and money. The peoples of countries like Georgia and Ukraine, as the Honourable Member for Huntingdon pointed out, they are not just pliable entities. They do not aspire to be under the thumb of the Russians. There is a direct link between democratizing and the desire to move out of Russia's orbit, to be part of the West, to be part of a global society, to be wealthy and to be free. Now, Russia's response too often is to blame the West or fascism or the CIA, which runs the internet, Never is it to examine the reason why people would want to be out of Russian yoke, not why they wish to move away from what is historically being seen as brutal and somewhat arbitrary control. And again, Russia's response to this, as we've seen in Georgia, in Moldova, and Ukraine, is to increase the levels of destabilization, increase the levels of violence, in order to force countries back to accept Russian suzerainty. However, there is hope. Ukrainians, many of them, now see their future in the West. Vladimir Putin's greatest achievement in the East Slavic world may be the creation of a single Ukrainian political identity. I think there is a grand bargain here, which I would very much encourage the Minister to consider, although I suspect the government will not make it. And that grand bargain is this. We spend vast sums in war zones which have produced little. I have lost count of the numbers of ridiculous and failed DFID projects that I patrolled past in Afghanistan and Iraq, which stand like monuments to the vanity of liberal imperialism. There is an opportunity here, as part of this Marshall Plan, to offer significant funding and support for a country which is near us, and whose stability and prosperity would yield not some generalized warm and fuzzy feeling, but significant geostrategic dividends in terms of peace, in terms of locking in the post-Cold War world, also in terms of extending the EU's influence. And I'm a Brexiteer, but I expect that many people, I accept that many people in Eastern Europe look to Britain and look to the EU as models, and I don't doubt that at all. We spend billions on Africa, ridiculous sums of the EU. Can we please spend some bilateral aid to do something significant stability encouraging in Eastern Europe and specifically in Ukraine? The quicker that Ukraine reforms, and I will wind up in the next minute or two, I'm aware that others wish to speak. The quicker that Ukraine reforms, and it has been pitifully slow, the stronger it will be, the stronger its people will be, the better able Ukraine and Eastern Europe will be to resist Russian active measures. The Ukrainians need to help themselves. But I believe as part of a grand bargain with that important strategic country, there is much more that we could be doing. And I recommend greater involvement, I recommend greater DFID involvement, and I recommend working with the EU, with the US, with our Canadian allies, who are very influential in Ukraine because of the Ukrainian diaspora, not only in Derby, but also in many parts of the Canadian plains, working with these countries to increase our leverage and to offer a grand bargain to the Ukrainians as part of a geopolitical victory of a significant type in eastern Ukraine. Thank you.